I'm just going to jump right in, and the topic of this month's webinar is reporting and charting for MongoDB, and doing it in a very simple way, in a very fast way. And probably everybody who's on the webinar is using MongoDB. So MongoDB is slightly different than a relational database, and part of what MongoDB does bring is simplicity. And so trying to layer existing reporting tools on top of MongoDB, some of them do support MongoDB, most of them don't. Even those that do try to make MongoDB look like a relational database, so you have to map things into kind of like table structures. And takes away from some of the flexibility and ease of use of Mongo. So instead, JSON Studio's system for MongoDB that is purpose built. That is purpose built for MongoDB, and therefore remains with the simplicity that you're used to. So, what is JSON Studio in general? JSON Studio is a suite of tools. It's not just a reporting or a BI tool. It's a suite of tools that's used throughout the life cycle of MongoDB implementations. It's a development tool. It's a set of tools for QA, but a lot of it is about giving access to MongoDB in a very simple way. It's been around for a while. In June in Mongo World, it received the award for best tooling from MongoDB, the company. I don't know what all these pop-ups are. Anyway, and what I'll do today is I'll just go through a very simple scenario. So this is what I'm going to focus on. And I'm really going to do this from scratch. I'm not going to assume anything. I'm going to start from scratch and just show you how simple it is. So the first thing I'll do is I'll start from a fresh download evaluation copy. I'll install it. I'll use the tool. I'll build a report, show it to you. Then go a little bit into the architecture of the system. Then we'll build a few more reports and go into charts and hopefully leave a lot of time for questions. Okay, so JSON Studio as a tool takes all of these tools, all of these kind of, again, if I go to this slide, all of the 10 tools that exist within JSON Studio are all available through one installation, so you don't have to install multiple things. And it's available for Linux, Mac OS, and Windows. I'm going to install it on my MacBook. So I have here an empty directory. I have nothing here. And I have in my downloads folder, I've already downloaded the system. So I've downloaded all of the installers. It just comes as a zip file. And what I'll do is I'll unzip the package. Okay, so I could go into a window and double click it, etc. But I just prefer doing it like this. So I'll unzip the Mac OS version of JSON Studio. Okay, and this is really everything. And then I will, you see I have a Sonar Finder Mac OS. I'll CD, I'll change directory to there. And then here I have the files for instructions for how to install, but really installation is very simple. I just run the install shell, and in Windows it's a batch. And then I have to accept the license agreement. I have to supposedly read all of it and then say yes. And it asks me where I want to install it. So I just want to say install it up here. So just above me, call it v26. Ask me if that's really where I want to install it. I say yes. It gives me a default configuration for things like the port number, because JSON Studio is a browser-based system, so there's really no client. So it's really useful when I want to install it, not just on my desktop for myself, but also I can have a shared instance for a lot of people that need to access reports. And I'll explain the architecture in a sec. But there's a default for all the ports, and whether I'm going to use regular MongoDB authentication or Kerberos authentication, etc. If I want to use the default, I just say yes. Ask me whether to delete some files. I say yes. Do I want to start it? I say yes. And then it'll start the system. Okay, so installation takes about a minute, depending on where you are, and it opens up the login page. I actually prefer to use Chrome, so I'm just gonna go to this page from here, from my Chrome. Okay, and then so now I have JSON Studio up and running, and the first thing that I want to do is connect to my MongoDB instance or cluster or database, and build the query so that I can run a report. Okay, so what I need to do is I need to put in my username, password, where my instance resides, what port it's listening on, and which database I want to connect to. Okay, so pretty simple, just the MongoDB information. And then what it does, it connects to my cluster, and it shows me all of the databases that I have. So here on my left-hand side are all my databases. So for example, you can see my test database has 105 collections. If I put my mouse over it, it gives me the stats about this database. In this case, the data that I'm going to be using is in my test2, so I'll expand the test2 database, and I'll see the 63 collections that I have in this database, and I'm going to use this Ensemble 1 collection, which is the documents of, I actually don't exactly understand all the information in here. It's something about genes, because we're doing a project with a biotech company, and this is kind of non-confidential data that they showed us, but it's basically every document in here is some kind of either a chromosome or some other assembly level within their genome data or genetic data. And what you see here on the bottom left-hand side are the documents in this collection. So you see here it says number 1. So this is my first document, and this is my second document, etc. And suppose that I need to create a report for somebody that will show me information, but maybe not everything that's in the collection. So maybe I want to do some type of filtering on this. Okay, so I want to see things like show me all of the data based on, say, the assembly level. So I can ask for chromosomes versus other things, and maybe things like the build number. Okay, so I may have different samples and builds, and I want to filter based on these things. So how do I create a filter? What I do is I create an operator and then a condition that says a certain field has to be um, either equal or whatever the operator is for that value. So in my case, what I want to do is, instead of saying it always has to be equal to chromosome, I want to do a like condition. And why? Because then I don't have to type the whole word in. So I'll pick the like operator, and then I will double click on the value, which in this case is a chromosome. And what it does is it adds that condition. And so you see the query that's being constructed down here is showing that I'm going to do a find where the assembly level is a regular expression of whatever this value is. And then I'll also do the same thing like on the gene build. And you see that as I'm running, it's updating the query, and it's also updating the number of results that it's showing. So really, there are only 21 documents which match this value. Now, the reason that I did a like condition versus an equal condition is that, for example, now I can go in here, and instead of doing all of this value, I can just put 2012. And the minute that I put 2012, you see I now got more results because I may have different samples from 2012, and I did a like condition for that purpose. So I can really be very flexible in terms of um, the query structure that I produce. And really, what I'm doing now as think of this as a power user is I'm designing my query. So what I've done is I've put in all kinds of conditions, and maybe and I see the results right here on this area. I see a tabular representation of the results of this query, and here, so kind of like a report, and here at the bottom I see a JSON representation of the results of this query. And I can modify it further. Instead of just adding filters, suppose that, I look at this information and I say, some of these columns are meaningful for my users in the report and some of them are not. Maybe, for example, this column is just junk, right? It's always zero. So I can click the remove and it'll be removed from my report, okay? And I can click the remove over here and another one gets removed, or I can go the other way around. I can instead just decide what to leave on my report. And it's modifying the query, so it's kind of like a point and click approach instead of having to type all this information into the shell or into something like this. And when I'm happy with this report, and you can always kind of see the underlying code that is generating this report, I can decide that I'm going to save it, right? So I can call it webinar1, okay, and I can publish it. Okay, so what happens when I publish it? Um, what happens is that now whatever this query is and the structure that I've created is now available for me, for example, to send to my users. So, as an example, I can click the publish URL button, okay, and decide this is the query that's going to be run. How do I want my users to see the results? Do I want them to see it as a report? Do I really want them to see the JSON, etc.? Right? So let's say I want a report and I don't even want them to have to put in a password in order to get the report, but I don't want any limit. Then I just, play with these parameters. And when I'm done, I do a publish URL. And what the publish URL does is it gives me a URL, either kind of a transparent URL, and I'll explain kind of what this gateway component is in a second. Or it's a non-transparent URL, meaning it takes all these values and it encodes it. And now I can take this, for example, URL, and I can send it to somebody in an email. I can send it to my users. I can create a dashboard with a bunch of links really using these URLs so that, for example, I'll open a different browser. If another person comes in and gets this email from me and opens this up, in their browser, what will happen is they will get the report. So this is exactly the report that I've just built, without any limit, et cetera, et cetera. So, so really the entire process does take minutes, okay? From the time you first look at the JSON documents until the time you have something that you can give to your users, it takes minutes. Now, of course, the more complex the query is, the more time you're going to spend building it, but building it is also very easy. It's based on this point and click type approach. Now the thing that's really very clear is that um, you wouldn't really do things based on a hard coding, right? So for example, if I go back to my query, you see that my query, the first condition that I added was I said I wanted the assembly level to be like a chromosome, but really I would never hard code the chromosome because sometimes they would want to do it based on chromosomes. Sometimes they would do it based on a super config. So really what I want to do is I want to parameterize this. So instead of putting the value in here, I'll put a parameter, and a parameter is something that starts with $dollar. Okay, so I'll put here level. Okay, I'll call this this is a new parameter called level. And here, instead of 2012, I'll call it a build. Okay, and what I'm doing is I'm parameterizing the query, and if I now save it and publish it again. Okay, so remember that when I publish something, it's not that I'm publishing the data of the report itself. What I'm doing is I'm publishing the query and the mechanism by which to produce a report, so that every time somebody calls the report is built on the fly for them and they see real live data. It's not that I'm just taking a snapshot of data. So if I publish this URL now, you see that it knows that there are variables. It knows that there's a level variable and a build variable. Now, if I want, I can hard code it. I can put here chromosome in here, but more likely than not, this is not something that I will want to hard code for my users. My users will put this thing in. Okay, so for example, I can say, yes, publish this URL. And you know what? I'll even leave the password empty because maybe I want them to know the password, or I'll put their user for the password. And so if I publish this URL and make a copy of it and try it again as though I got it from an email, then what will happen is instead of the report, first the user is presented with a form, and the form is what is required in order to run the query, because the query cannot function without knowing what exactly to put here. So if I put here super config, or actually it doesn't matter because it's a regular expression, so I can put any part of it, and the build is anything with 2012, then it will go and compute the result, and it's different. Remember, before the assembly level was always a chromosome. Now I'm seeing super config because that's kind of what I asked for. And if I did exactly the same thing, and right, so let me open it from scratch so it doesn't remember anything. If I put just S here, okay, and 2012, then what did I do? My password's wrong. Okay, so now I'm going to get both chromosomes and super config because both of them have an S in them. Okay, so the data that the user receives is whatever is based on the parameters or the values that they map for the parameter. Okay, so this was a really fast and simple, install it, get up and running, and just show you how simple it is without any mapping, without any involving multiple sets of people, etc. So let me explain a little bit about the architecture and how things work. Um, so so first of all, regarding JSON Studio, so you saw that when I installed it, like if I go back to my installation window and go to my v26 is where I installed it, and you see when I install the studio, I have a directory full of stuff. Some of these things are the applications that we've been using up until now, which was what the browser was hitting, and that's what's under the web apps directory. And the other applications are things like SQL transfer and resource manager and profile. So those are more of the developer tools. So everything that we're using today are not these, they're everything are web applications. So in terms of the reporting aspect, the way it works is JSON Studio runs within a Tomcat server, and and it's a very lightweight Tomcat server. So you're free to decide what your installation should look like. You can decide that you're just one developer or one analyst, and you just want to use this tool for yourself. So you would install it locally on your desktop or laptop. If you, on the other hand, have 10 business users and a few analysts and 3 QA guys and et cetera, then you can say to yourself, why should everybody have their own installation? Why don't I install it on one shared server? And since the application comes through a browser, then they can all hit the same server and view the same data. They can share metadata as they're building these reports, et cetera, et cetera. And the third option, which is also very common, is putting it on some kind of inside a cloud. So if your MongoDB databases are themselves hosted within some kind of a cloud provider, it sometimes makes sense to put JSON Studio also in the same place close to the database. And actually, in about a week or two, we're going to have a JSON Studio AMI within the Amazon AWS marketplace, so that you don't even have to download a license from JSON Studio. You can just go directly and open an AMI directly on AWS. So this is JSON Studio. It's the part where you develop things. Now, what happens when you finish developing things? If you remember, after I built my query, I saved it and I clicked this publish thing. So what really happens is this, okay? When you build things with JSON Studio and you hit the publish button, the metadata for the report goes into a MongoDB database that you specify when you connect to JSON Studio, where all the metadata gets stored. So the definition of the query and the structure of the report, et cetera, are stored in some MongoDB database. It doesn't have to be your MongoDB database. This could be your data. It would usually be a separate instance or a separate database just to keep it clean, although you can keep it anywhere you want. And then when you take one of these URLs, and if I look at what these URLs look like, right? If I do a paste again, you'll see that they start with this thing called gateway. You see here it says gateway. So really what happens is there's another Tomcat server. It could be another, or it could be exactly the same Tomcat server where the JSON Studio is running off. And when a user wants to see a report, they really hit that server and they give it a set of values. Those values that are encoded in this URL are things like, what is the name of the query that I want to run? What is the name of the collection that I want to pull data out? And all kinds of other things like, how do I want to structure it? Do I want to get it as a CSV? Do I want to get it as a JSON, a report, et cetera? And all these things are things that you as a creator of the report specify. So when the user hits that gateway, the gateway decodes that URL, then it goes to the MongoDB metadata database, it pulls out the definition of the query, it runs the query on the user's behalf, right? So it accesses the data from the MongoDB database, and then it formats the data based on how you asked for it, and it passes it back to the user. Okay, so it's very simple, and it runs every time that the user invokes that URL. So, again, going back to the example over here, okay, if I want to give somebody the ability not to see a report, but actually to pull some data, then I can say something like this. I can say, instead of a report, let me pick a CSV. Okay, and if I send this to someone, okay, if I send this to someone and that someone gets it by email or whatnot, right, and they put in chromosome 2012, then what they get is because that endpoint said, get the data as a CSV data, then they'll actually get the data directly to themselves, okay, as opposed to seeing a report, and then they can do whatever they want. The same is true if I went over here in the publishing and I chose JSON, what would come back is not CSV or a report, but the actual JSON of the result set. And that's very useful, maybe not so much for users, but when you want to use these endpoints from other programs. So you're writing a program that needs access to some of this data, instead of opening a direct connection to Mongo and with a certain driver and going in and writing the code to access the data, pull it out, do projections, do selections, etc. You can just use these endpoints and have the data returned as JSON, and then parse the JSON and use it from your own program. So it's useful not just as a reporting server, but also as kind of an API server for any data within here. Okay. And the same is true for not just for reports, but it's also true for graphs. So if you look at this data, so now I'm back in the studio. I'm back as a developer or a power analyst. Instead of looking at the data in a tabular format, I can go and hit the charting button. Okay, and it will go and it will, or actually, let me look at a bit more data. Okay, so I'll increase the number of records that I'm looking at. So what it's done is it's drawn a certain default graph. It went and analyzed the data sets, and down here it's showing me the x-axis is the assembly level, and it's plotting the interpro, the protein, some things about the protein codings um, as a bar chart. But I don't have to use the bar chart. I can say, forget about this. Let me build my own graph. Let me build a scatter plot, for example. And maybe my group build. Okay, so I'll drag and drop this into the group, and the name is going to be the name of the sample. Okay, so I'll drag it into the field um, called bubble name. And then, down here in annotation, I have a whole bunch of numeric data. Like if I click on these, it will show me the numeric data for each one of these. Okay, and I can decide, okay, I want to plot the interpro on the x-axis versus the protein go on the y-axis versus ngo will be my bubble size. And I assume by now you probably understand I have no clue what these numbers mean and what I'm just picking randomly numbers into the tool, but it's very dynamic, right? If I pick another one and drag it over here, it just updates the graph. And when I'm happy with this, when I say, yeah, this is kind of what I wanted to provide to my users, one option is for them to come in and do it themselves. But if I have to give it to them, or I want to build a dashboard based on all of these reports and charts, then what I do is, again, I once I'm happy with this thing, I'll say, great, let me call this webinar 2. Okay, and again, I'll publish it. Okay, and then it's exactly the same as before. I can now expose it as a URL. I can say, limit this to like 30 data points. Say publish URL, and then send this to my user. Okay, and so now if I come in here and I put this URL in, and again it'll ask me for whatever it is that I want to filter by. Then what it will generate for me is the graph itself. Okay, so instead of me seeing a report, now I can get access directly to the graph, and these are live graphs. So what the user is getting back, if you look underneath, if you look at the source code for this thing, this is an actual D3 graph. Okay, and so it's very dynamic. Users can manipulate it and change things. And the idea is to make kind of the power user's job of exposing data in MongoDB the simplest possible. Okay. Um, okay, so now let me go back to my studio. Okay, so what I've done until now is I've shown you a little bit about um, the reporting and the visualization capabilities of the studio, but actually I only showed this through the ability to export ready-made reports to people, but it's also very common for power users to just look at the data and manipulate it themselves. So I'm looking at this, and I say I want a parallel plot, and I want to see this data, and now I want to drag this instead of here to here, and it's very dynamic. It's a really good exploratory environment. If somebody is an analyst type, not afraid to work with data, it's a very convenient thing, and they can add more points very easily. I can add as many points as I want. At some point, this thing is going to become very meaningless. Um, but it's a good data exploration environment. And everything that I've done until now, I really did through the search capability, right? I had a pretty simple query that was based on a simple filter. The other type of query that you usually have, actually, it's more common to have a query that is based on the aggregation framework than it is based on a simple search, okay? Because simple searches will only return the documents after a certain filter, but you can't really group things together or build any complex queries. And the way you build complex queries within MongoDB is using this thing called the aggregation framework. Okay, so in order to do that, JSON Studio has a good tool for building aggregation pipelines as well. If I click on the analytics link over here, it will take me there. Okay, and what I can do is again pick my starting collection. I'm going to stick with the same one. Okay, ensemble one. And really what I'm doing now is building a pipeline. And a pipeline in MongoDB is a set of stages, and each stage is a simple transformation. Um, so for example, suppose that I wanted to group things by the zero type. Okay, so what I would do is I would create a new stage, which would be a grouping stage. So really, the building of this query is very visual. It's not writing code. It's very visual. I can say, okay, I want to do a grouping, and I want to group by the zero type. So I double click on the zero type. You see that it added a certain condition here to the grouping area. And I want to add a count, for example. So I want to know how many of these documents have a certain zero type. And as I'm clicking things, it's really adding more and more code to my query. And at any point in time, I can hit the run button and see the results here on the right. So zero type C has only one, zero type A2 has four, zero type 4A has two. I can have all kinds of aggregate values. So maybe I want the minimum of the base count. So those I already know base counts are important enough. They're kind of they take you within the sequencing of the entire genome where they start, where they end. So usually we look at the minimum, the max of these things. So all I do is I just click on what it is I want computed, and I click on what to compute. And it creates some defaults, which I can always change. Like if I don't like the name that it created, which is minimum base count, I can always change it and call it, my min. Okay. But it's all very accessible to me. I can always run it and see it computed on the right-hand side. So I can do really whatever I want. Very complex queries. I can do aggregations, averages. I can average the interpro value for these things and run it. And then maybe the next thing that I want to do is the next stage in my pipeline maybe is some type of a sort. Like, there's a lot of zero types. I want to look at the ones that have a lot of samples for them. So maybe I'll do another stage, which will be a sort stage, and I'll sort on the count. Now, the reason it turned yellow is it's showing me that the values that I'm looking at right now may be stale because I've already edited the query since the result was run. So I'll double click on the count. You see it added a condition that says you should sort on count, and because there's a checkbox over here, it means it's a descending sort. So I'll run it, and indeed, it shows me that 0157H7 has 157 samples, and it also shows me serotype empty has 9,500, and maybe that's just bad data. So for the sake of the example, I'll add another stage, which will be a filter stage. And what I'll say is that I want to filter out, so I'll say not equal to anything that's empty because it's just meaningless to me. I have to be careful of where I click these things. So if I run it now, then it had filtered out the one that had the empty serotype and only showing me the ones that have a real serotype. And then when I think I'm happy with this thing, then again, what I would normally do is I'd go into this pipeline that I've just created and I give it a name, call it webinar 3. And it's asking me, am I creating a new one or renaming my pipeline? So I'm renaming it. And then again, I have to publish it. Okay, so at this point, I've taken a query that is relatively more complex, right? If I look at the pipeline code, this is the actual pipeline code that you can take and copy paste it into a program or into the shell in order to run the same query. But I've given it a name. I've called it webinar 3. And again, the minute I give it a name, I can do the same trick I did before. I can show the values to someone. So in the same way that somebody who is already logged into the studio can click on report and see the data in the report, in the same way, if my users do not log into JSON Studio, I can just say publish URL, okay, and um, and send it to them, and then they'll be able to view the same data without even understanding this whole concept of MongoDB and JSON, etc. Okay, so they get this URL in an email, they click it, they see the value. This report is always live, it's always real. And again, the same way, I can go in here. Once I'm happy with this data, I can go into my charting. From the complex data, I can say, what I'm trying to do is a pie, and in the pie, maybe I want to plot. I don't want any of those, maybe just the count. Okay, so I remove all these things, get rid of this. This is what I want. The minute I'm happy with this, I give it a name. Okay, and again, the same thing is true. I can take this thing and send it to someone. And I can open this from another browser just so it's not the same, it's not, and so everything is super easy to do. Everything is very accessible. Okay, so of course, there's a lot of functionality in JSON Studio. You can pretty much do any type of query building and data visualization, etc. But for the sake of time, I won't go into more details. The title for the webinar was doing, or I don't remember the title exactly, but it was something like, doing it very quickly and very cheaply. Okay, so quickly, hopefully I've shown you how easy it is to do these things. In terms of the cost for these components is also very low. You can go to the website and see the details, but it's really simple. It's a $4.95 per user, per named user for the JSON Studio, and that includes all 10 tools. So it doesn't matter, if you buy a license for a developer or a power user, they can access everything from the Excel interface to the reporting to the schema analysis, etc. And it's $500 per gateway thread because, again, remember the gateway really may be used to serve a lot of people, right? If you're using this as kind of like a reporting server, you may have, 50 business users who may need to access a certain set of reports, and you're not going to buy a JSON Studio license for every one of these users, A, because it would be expensive, and B, it's overkill. They're not going to go in and build those reports. They just want to have access to those reports. So typically you'd buy a certain number of threads so that if you have many users, they can connect concurrently and pull the data. So, as a few example, if you have kind of a small departmental project with 2 developers and 20 end users, you would typically buy 2 licenses for the studio and 2 or 4 threads, depending on the volume of your calls, or if you use also APIs. And the total cost would be, a couple $1,000. If you have like a bigger project with 100 end users, you would expect to spend something like $5,000. And if you have really, some of our customers buy this as, like for example, if they build their own Mongo as a service, and therefore they have many instances, then they buy a set number so that it could be shared by these users. So it's a little bigger spend, but compared to the other options, all of the other options will cost something like 20, 30, 40,000, even for a small departmental environment. So it really is a tenth of the cost. Um, so right now I think that's pretty much what I wanted to cover. And we still have about 15 minutes for questions, which is good. Kind of what are next possible steps that you can do if you want to learn more. So the first is there are plenty more demos of the tools of both the reporting side and other tools within JSON Studio. There are very good tutorials, and here's a link to the first tutorial, and then the rest are just right after this one, and they take you step by step to do things. There is a trial version that's a fully working version for 2 weeks that you can download in this link. And here is the link for getting more information on pricing and buying subscriptions. And if you do buy within a month of today, then you can use the MugTX discount code, which is good for a month for 10% off anything you buy. And then if you want to go a little bit deeper, and you want to, for example, see the system in action on your data itself, then we're happy to do that. Because these things are so easy to build, if you want to send us some of your data and queries and say, show us how easy it is to build, we'll be happy to do that, because it really does take usually a few minutes if it's clear enough. And so if you want any follow-up of that sort, please contact through this email, roy@jsonar.com, and that's it. And now, Zach, if we could do any questions, that'd be great.